WHO deserves a seat? Imagine this: you're standing at an airport check-in counter. Your ticket in hand, your suit pressed, your place in the world earned. But before you can take your rightful seat, a single look from a flight attendant tells you everything. You don't belong here. At least, that's what they think. This is James Carter's reality. A man who has built his way to the top. A man who commands boardrooms and shapes industries. Suddenly reduced not by his credentials, not by his money, but by the color of his skin. But what happens when the man they tried to dismiss is the one who owns the very airline they work for? What happens when power shifts in an instant? When the whispers turn to silence? When those who believed they controlled the rules realize the game was never theirs to play? And just when you think it's over, when justice has been served at 30,000 feet, the real fight begins. Because power does not like to lose. And when certain men can no longer control the world around them, they will do whatever it takes to rewrite the rules. So here's my question to you: what would you do if everything you earned was questioned before you even had the chance to sit down? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button. Subscribe for more stories that make you think. And now, let's begin. James Carter stood at the check-in counter, his grip tightening around the leather handle of his briefcase. The airport was busy in that particular way it always was: chaotic yet methodical. A world moving in every direction but still managing to function. The people around him were preoccupied, lost in their own hurried thoughts, glancing at screens, checking their phones, adjusting their luggage. But as he took his place in line, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A glance, a double take, the stiffness in the airline attendant's posture as she noticed him stepping forward. The way her eyes flickered just for a second before settling into something carefully neutral. James had seen it before. Next, the attendant said, her voice clipped. Professional. James stepped up, slipping his phone from his pocket, ready to scan his boarding pass. First class check-in, sir, she said, her smile tight, rehearsed. I know. Her expression didn't change, but the silence stretched just a beat too long. A hesitation, a moment of assessment. Business class passengers check in over there, she said, nodding toward the economy counter across the way. James exhaled slowly, pressing his tongue against the roof of his mouth. It was happening again. I'm exactly where I need to be, he replied, keeping his voice measured, even. The attendant's smile faltered. Sir, I'm not sure if you. But before she could finish, a voice cut in. Problem? The man standing behind James in line, a white man in his late 50s. Dressed in a slightly wrinkled business suit, leaned forward, smirking as he adjusted his cheap tie. He held his briefcase with an air of entitlement. The kind of man who expected to be served first. Who had long since stopped asking whether he deserved the space he occupied. No problem, James replied smoothly, shifting his weight slightly. Are you sure? The man continued, eyes flicking between James and the attendant. Because it looks like you're trying to board in the wrong class. The words landed heavily, deliberate, carrying the weight of something that had no need to be spoken outright. The attendant crossed her arms, emboldened. Sir, business class has. James smiled, just slightly, just enough for it to register as something unsettling. Standards, he finished for her. A flicker of something crossed her face. But before she could respond, his phone rang. James answered. Yes, it's me. I need you to check something immediately. The air around them changed. The white businessman, still smug, glanced at James with curiosity. Then at the attendant. The people around them, once indifferent, now tuned in. The whispers began, quiet, uncertain. The attendant's brows furrowed. Sir, there are no phone calls allowed at the counter. And then, her own desk phone rang. She hesitated, startled. The moment stretched long, thick with something unspoken, something ancient yet fresh. As if history had come alive in this very moment, replaying its familiar rhythms. She picked up the phone. Check-in desk. Flight 308 to London. Her voice was crisp, dismissive, but within seconds, something changed. Her expression tightened, then paled. She stiffened, standing straighter. Wait, what? A beat of silence. James watched as her fingers trembled, as she clicked through her computer screen with urgency. Her eyes darting between him and the blinking alerts now appearing on her screen. The businessman beside him, who had been relishing the moment just seconds ago, was no longer smirking. James adjusted his cufflinks. Go ahead, he said, his voice steady, low. Double check. I'll wait. The attendant swallowed, her once confident demeanor unraveling at the seams. And in that instant, everything shifted. The unspoken rule, the silent assumption, the carefully veiled hierarchy that had played out so effortlessly it all cracked open. Exposed for what it was. And everyone in that terminal knew. The situation was about to turn upside down. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, a noose tightening around the space between them. The attendant stood frozen, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, eyes flicking between James and the flickering text on her screen. Passengers nearby, once distracted by their own affairs, had now become an audience. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others held their phones discreetly. The slow creep of curiosity overtaking their earlier indifference. A young black woman in the crowd smirked knowingly. Already pressing record, she had seen this play out before. But this time, it was different. The businessman beside James shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, a forced chuckle spilling from his lips. As if he were trying to laugh off a joke he suddenly wasn't sure he was in on. CEO? His voice was lighter now. Uncertain, he licked his lips, casting a glance at James. Searching for confirmation. That's a joke, right? James turned slightly, just enough to really look at him. The man's confidence faltered. You tell me, James said, his voice smooth, deliberate. The attendant let out a shallow breath, her chest rising and falling quickly now. She pressed a few more keys. Desperate, frantic, as though she might somehow undo what had already been set in motion. The screen would tell her nothing she could fix. James Lawson, Chief Executive Officer, Global Airlines. The reality hit like a crack of thunder. Loud even in silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, shifting the air, tilting the balance of power so fast, so violently, that those who had stood so comfortably on the other side of it were now grasping for footing. The attendant inhaled sharply. I didn't realize. James tilted his head. No, you didn't. The businessman stepped back, gripping the handle of his suitcase as if he could disappear into it. His posture, once open and smug, had curled inward, a man suddenly aware of the ground beneath him. This can't be real, he muttered. Would you like me to prove it? James asked, his voice so measured, so steady, that it only made the moment heavier. The businessman's mouth opened, then closed, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting wildly between James and the attendant, who now stood rigid, her hands clasped together, shaking. Then, as if on cue, the airport's overhead screens flickered. A new announcement rolled across in sharp white letters against a deep blue background. Effective immediately. Global Airlines reaffirms its commitment to exceptional service and inclusivity. Discrimination has no place in our company. It was corporate language carefully worded, polished to perfection, but its meaning was anything but subtle. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. The weight of the moment, now undeniable, bore down on every person watching. James remained still, his hands resting easily at his sides. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He was simply waiting, because that was the real power. Wasn't it? The ability to let the weight of their own actions catch up to them. You assumed I didn't belong, James said finally, his voice quieter now but sharper. A knife's edge, not because of my ticket, not because of policy, but because of what you saw. The attendant's breath was shallow. Sir, I deeply apologize. James held up a hand. Don't apologize to me. The air tightened. Apologize to every person you've dismissed, disrespected, or devalued because you assumed they weren't good enough. The businessman, who had once reveled in the moment, now clutched his suitcase like a lifeline. His feet shifted, an animal preparing to bolt. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and rushed toward the gate. His departure swift and humiliating. James exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, then turned back to the attendant. She swallowed, her face drained of color. Mr. Lawson, I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to what? James asked, stepping closer. Assume that a black man in a suit couldn't possibly belong in first class? That someone like me couldn't be the one running the very airline you work for? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. James studied her, the way her shoulders had folded inward, the way she gripped the edge of the desk as if it might keep her upright. He had seen this before, too, the unraveling, the way people suddenly saw themselves. stripped of the illusions they had comfortably lived behind. A figure appeared from the far side of the terminal. A man in a crisp suit. His ID badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Corporate. Mr. Lawson, the executive said, breathless, his face tight with urgency. We are so sorry for this incident. Please allow us to make things right. James raised an eyebrow. Oh, don't worry, he said, smooth as glass. I'm about to. The executive swallowed hard. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted again. Security had arrived, but they weren't looking at James anymore. They were looking at the businessman who had tried to take what wasn't his. At the attendant who had built an entire moment around an assumption that had cost her everything. The businessman, halfway to the gate, heard the commotion behind him and picked up speed. He nearly tripped over himself as he disappeared into the terminal, vanishing into the crowd. The attendant, still clutching the desk, barely managed a whisper. Please, sir, she murmured, her voice small. I need this job. James studied her, his expression unreadable. Maybe next time, he said, quiet but firm. You'll remember that professionalism isn't just about wearing a uniform. It's about how you treat people. A final pause. And then, with a nod from James, security escorted her away. The crowd had long since stopped pretending they weren't watching. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others shifted, uncomfortable, unsure of what they had just witnessed but certain that it had meant something. And James? James adjusted his cufflinks, picked up his ticket, and walked toward his rightful seat. Because today, he hadn't just reclaimed his place. He had made sure no one else like him would have to fight for theirs again. The air inside the first-class cabin was different. Not just in the way it smelled cleaner, crisper, laced with the scent of fresh leather and overpriced cologne, but in the way it felt. It was quieter here, the hushed, effortless silence of people who never questioned their right to comfort. James Carter knew this silence well. He walked through the aisle with the same deliberate pace he had carried through boardrooms, through courtrooms, through every space that had once tried to tell him, in 100 different ways, that he did not belong. He felt the weight of eyes on him, some discreet, some bold, some assessing whether they had miscalculated his presence. And yet, as he settled into his rightful seat, something in the air had shifted. A flight attendant, younger, nervous, approached him hesitantly. She was not the one from earlier. But she knew. Oh, she knew. Mr. Carter, she said, voice careful, posture rigid with the need to overcompensate. Would you like a drink before takeoff? James exhaled, slowly. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the early morning or the weight of travel. Yes, he said, watching her. Make sure it's the finest on board. The flight attendant nodded, disappearing into the galley, relief written all over her face. But before he could fully exhale, before he could let the moment pass, he saw him. A man, an older black gentleman sitting in the economy section, dressed in a modest but well-pressed suit. His silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through a newspaper. There was nothing loud about him, nothing demanding. He was quiet, a man who had learned to shrink just enough to fit into the spaces he was given. James knew that kind of man. He had been raised by them. And without thinking, without asking for permission, James unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, and gestured toward the flight captain, who had stepped out of the cockpit. I need a favor, James said. The captain, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the stiff posture of someone who had spent too many years in control, hesitated. He had been briefed, of course. He had been briefed. He had seen what happened at the gate. And though his expression remained neutral, James could see the calculation behind his eyes. Yes, Mr. Carter? James nodded toward the man in economy. Upgrade him to this seat. The captain hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch. Not long enough to refuse, but long enough to consider whether refusal was an option. The first-class passengers had begun to listen now, their heads turning ever so slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop. Sir, the captain said slowly, carefully, we typically. James tilted his head. You typically let men like me fight for our place here. The captain swallowed. Within seconds, a flight attendant was dispatched. James watched as she walked to the older gentleman, leaning down with a polite, almost nervous smile. Sir, there's been a change to your seating arrangement, she said softly. The man looked up from his paper, adjusting his glasses. Excuse me? She gestured toward first class. Mr. Carter has requested that you take a seat." The cabin grew impossibly still. The man looked up, then really looked up, meeting James's gaze across the aisle. And for a moment, nothing moved. There was recognition in his eyes. Something unspoken but deeply understood. A silent language passed between them, built on decades of knowing what it meant to be asked to prove yourself, to earn what others were given freely. He hesitated, as if unsure whether this was real. "There must be some mistake," the man said finally. "I didn't request an upgrade." The flight attendant, still smiling tightly, shook her head. "No mistake, sir." And so, slowly, carefully, he closed his newspaper, buttoned his suit jacket, and stood. James met him halfway down the aisle, extending his hand. "I figured you were the kind of man who belonged here," James said. The older gentleman clasped his hand firmly, his grip steady despite the weight of the moment. "I appreciate that, son," he said, voice low. "More than you know." James watched as he settled into the first-class seat, the seat that had been denied to men like him for too long. And then, just as James turned to walk back to his new seat, he caught sight of another figure, the original attendant, the one who had told him he didn't belong. She was still there, standing near the entrance of the cabin, her uniform still perfectly pressed, her face carefully neutral, but James could see it the way her hands clenched slightly at her sides. The way her breath hitched ever so subtly as she realized what had just happened. She knew. Now, she knew. This moment it was never just about him. It was about every man who had ever been told to stand in a different line. About every woman who had been dismissed before she even spoke. About the quiet rules that had been written into the fabric of every system. Every expectation. Every silent, knowing glance that dictated who deserved what. James sat back in his seat, finally allowing himself to exhale. The flight attendant from earlier returned, placing his drink carefully on the tray in front of him. "May I offer you anything else before takeoff, sir?" she asked, her voice softer now. James picked up the glass, letting the cool weight of it rest in his palm. "Yes," he said, watching as the plane prepared for departure. A smooth flight. The plane rumbled to life, its engines roaring beneath them. And as it soared into the sky, James closed his eyes and thought, "Let them remember this." The plane had leveled out at cruising altitude, the hum of the engines settling into a steady rhythm beneath the quiet murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glassware. The tension from earlier had not fully disappeared, no. It lingered, stretched thin like a taut wire, humming beneath the surface. James Carter sat with his drink untouched, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of the glass. He could feel the eyes on him, some lingering too long, others darting away the moment he met their gaze. But it was the captain's voice, smooth and practiced, that cut through the cabin first. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for choosing Global Airlines for your journey today. Our flight time to London is approximately 6 hours. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." James allowed himself to breathe, just for a moment, and then the whispering started. It was quiet at first, like a slow-building current, the kind of conversation that didn't need volume to be heard, just enough of a shift in posture. Enough stolen glances to make it known. "Did you see what happened back there? They're saying he owns the airline. That can't be right. They let him upgrade just like that?" James had spent his life hearing those whispers. He had heard them in classrooms where teachers assumed he was in the wrong place. He had heard them in boardrooms where men like him were seen as guests instead of leaders. He had heard them in hotels, in restaurants, in spaces where he could afford everything and still be questioned as if he had stolen something. But he had never heard them in the air before. Not like this. The businessman, the same one who had tried to humiliate him at the check-in counter, was seated just a few rows away. His face was tight, unreadable, his fingers clenched around his armrest like he was holding onto something he could no longer control. And then, he stood. James watched as the man adjusted his tie, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for battle. There was something desperate about it now, something different from before. The smugness was gone, but in its place was something more dangerous: resentment. He walked past James's seat without a glance, straight toward the older black gentleman who now occupied his former first-class seat. And James knew, before the words even left the man's mouth, that something was coming. "Excuse me," the businessman said, forcing a thin smile. "I believe there's been a mistake." The older gentleman looked up from his newspaper, adjusting his glasses. His voice was calm, patient, the kind of patience that had been practiced over a lifetime of these moments. "I don't believe there has," he replied. The businessman exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I think you misunderstand me. You see, I had requested an upgrade myself. I've flown with this airline for years. I'm a platinum member. He paused, his voice dipping lower. "I just find it odd that this seat suddenly became available." James set his drink down. There it was. The unspoken rule. The quiet, coded language that had been used for generations to remind black men that no matter how hard they worked, how much they earned, how much they belonged, there would always be someone waiting to tell them they didn't. The businessman wasn't saying the words outright, but he might as well have. "This isn't your seat. You didn't earn this. You should know better than to think this is yours." The air in the cabin seemed to still. And then, James spoke. "Is there a problem?" The businessman turned, startled, as if he had forgotten that James was even there. His expression flickered first with irritation, then with something closer to recognition. "This doesn't concern you," the man said. His voice clipped. James smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, but it does." The businessman scoffed. "I don't see how." James leaned back slightly, folding his hands in his lap. He could feel the attention in the cabin shift again. Passengers pretending not to listen but hanging on to every word. "Well," James said, tilting his head, "considering that I was the one who requested this seat be given to the professor, I'd say it concerns me quite a bit." The businessman's face reddened. "You requested it?" he said, the words dragging like dead weight in his mouth. James held his gaze, waiting, giving the man enough time to hear himself. And the businessman did hear it. He heard what he had just implied. He heard the rules he had been playing by. The ones that said men like James, no matter how wealthy, no matter how powerful, still needed permission, still needed to ask. And yet here James was, giving orders. The businessman shifted uncomfortably. "I just think it's unusual." James nodded slowly. "Yes, I imagine it would seem unusual to you." The businessman let out a frustrated breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." He turned on his heel, stalking back toward his seat, his entire body tense with something unsaid. James watched him go, watched the way he sat back down, his shoulders stiff, his mouth a thin, hard line. The captain, who had been watching from a distance, took a step forward. "Is there an issue, Mr. Carter?" James took a slow sip of his drink. "No," he said finally. "Not anymore." The flight attendant from earlier appeared again, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she said hesitantly, "is there anything else I can do for you?" James considered her for a moment. And then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, "Yes, make sure that man," he nodded toward the professor, "gets whatever he asks for on this flight." The flight attendant nodded quickly. "Of course, sir." James let his head rest against the seat, exhaling deeply, because this was what power looked like. Not in the fights that were loud and obvious, but in the ones that were silent, the ones that happened in boardrooms, in restaurants, in first-class cabins where people thought their whispers wouldn't be heard. James had spent a lifetime learning how to listen. And now, finally, they were learning to listen to him. The plane moved steady and sure through the sky, carving its way through the night like a blade through silk. The world beneath them, oceans, cities, streets lined with stories, was distant now. But history, real history, had a way of sitting beside you no matter how high you climbed. James Carter sat in his seat, staring out the window, but he was not looking at the sky. He was looking backward, at every road that had led him here, at every room where he had been measured in glances before he had spoken a single word, at every moment where he had been underestimated, dismissed, tolerated but never expected. He could feel it now, like an ache in the bones. The way people still needed to be reminded. The way they still clung to the idea that power had a certain look. That success had a certain sound. That dignity had a certain color. And he could feel them watching him still, the passengers, the attendants, even the captain, each of them thinking something they were too careful to say. But the older man in his newly upgraded seat, he understood. He had not spoken since settling in, had not reacted to the businessman's entitled outburst, had not so much as lifted an eyebrow at the discomfort rippling through the cabin. He had simply been present and unmoved, existing in a space the world had never freely given him. And that, James knew, was the quietest rebellion of all. The attendant returned, standing beside the professor's seat with a cautious smile. "Sir, would you care for another drink?" The old man looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said, voice smooth as aged bourbon. "I believe I will." James watched as the attendant, still overly careful, still afraid of getting it wrong, leaned forward to place the glass on his tray. But before she could move away, the professor spoke again, this time turning to James. "You remind me of someone." James raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" The professor nodded, tilting his glass slightly before taking a slow sip. "I had a student once, young, sharp, but angry, thought the world owed him something." James smirked. "And did it?" The professor smiled slightly. "No." He leaned back against the plush seat, adjusting his glasses, but he made damn sure it knew he was there. James nodded, understanding. Silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of recognition. And then, just as James was about to close his eyes, the businessman from earlier stood up again. This time, there was no pretending, no forced politeness, no masking the frustration boiling beneath his carefully curated exterior. He strode straight to the flight attendant, his voice hushed but sharp, edged with something dangerous. "I want to file a complaint." The words landed like a gun cocking in a quiet room. The attendant stiffened. "Sir?" The businessman's face was red now, not from embarrassment, but from displacement, from anger, from that deeply rooted fear that always surfaced when a man like him realized the world was shifting under his feet. "This," he gestured wildly, flustered, "this whole situation, it's unacceptable." James exhaled slowly. "Here we go." The attendant glanced nervously between James and the businessman, suddenly aware that everyone was listening now. "I am sorry, sir, but..." "No," the businessman snapped, voice rising. "I want to know why he jabbed a finger toward the professor. Was given an upgrade over me." The temperature in the cabin dropped. Passengers shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A woman in the back took out her phone, not obviously, but deliberately. James folded his hands in his lap, watching. The professor, for the first time, looked directly at the man. He did not speak. He did not frown. He simply looked. And something in that quiet, deliberate gaze made the businessman hesitate. But only for a second. "This airline has standards," the businessman continued, desperate now. "There are rules. There is..." He struggled for the right word. And when he found it, he threw it out like a challenge. "Order." A soft laugh, low, deep, unmistakably knowing, escaped the professor's lips. "Order?" he repeated, the word tasting of history, of memory, of every battle fought in a courtroom. On a bus, at a lunch counter, on the streets, in the skies. James had heard this argument before, wrapped in different words, disguised in different policies, hidden behind different smiles. "It's just the way things are. We've always done it this way. You're making this about something it's not." He had spent a lifetime unraveling that lie. And tonight, it was unraveling again. James leaned forward, slow and deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but lethal. "You mean the kind of order that lets men like you believe that seat was always supposed to be yours?" The businessman's face twisted. The professor smiled slightly. "Careful, son," he murmured, tilting his glass again. "Your mask is slipping." The businessman froze. The professor turned back to his newspaper. He did not need to say anything more, because the truth was already in the air. The businessman clenched his jaw. His hands twitched at his sides, itching to do something, to grab hold of whatever had slipped through his fingers. But there was nothing left to grab. So, without another word, he turned sharply and walked back to his seat, his entire body coiled with rage. The cabin remained silent for a long time after that. James finally allowed himself to relax, settling into his seat as the quiet hum of the plane filled the space where old rules had once lived. The professor glanced at him, his lips curling in the barest hint of a smile. "You always fight like that?" James chuckled. "Only when I have to." The professor nodded approvingly. "Then I suppose I'll rest easy on this flight." James lifted his glass, mirroring the older man's small toast. The flight attendant, now more careful than ever, approached again. "Mr. Carter, can I get you anything?" James exhaled, the weight of the past and present pressing against his ribs. Heavy yet familiar. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. Just make sure it's a smooth flight." The engines hummed beneath them. And as the plane soared through the night, leaving one world behind and racing toward another, James thought, some battles don't happen in courtrooms or on the streets. Some happen right here, in the spaces they never expected us to enter. And tonight, in a cabin full of people who would remember this flight for years to come. James Carter knew. He had won. The plane had settled into the quiet of the night, its engines humming low like a distant storm on the horizon. A calm had returned to the cabin, or at least the illusion of it. But illusions had a way of cracking under the weight of truth. And truth had already made itself known tonight. James Carter sat motionless in his seat, his drink now forgotten, his mind replaying the events of the past hour with the sharp clarity of a man who had seen this before. The tension, the resistance, the slow, reluctant acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the order so carefully preserved had been disrupted. If only for a moment. But history had a way of fighting back. James knew this wasn't over. And sure enough, the moment arrived, creeping in like a shadow just beneath the surface. The businessman had been quiet since his failed protest. His seatbelt fastened, his hands gripping the armrests with a kind of tight, restrained fury. But anger like that didn't sit still for long. It festered. It looked for a way to strike back. And then he found one. James saw it happen in real time. The man turned his head slightly, just enough to scan the aisle, his gaze landing on one of the flight attendants, the original one. The woman who had tried to stop him at the check-in counter. Her face was pale, her posture stiff with nerves. James could see it in her. She was afraid. Afraid because she had been caught. Afraid because the mask she had worn so effortlessly had cracked under the weight of exposure. Afraid because she had assumed she had power, only to find herself stripped of it in front of an entire terminal. And the businessman knew that, too. He saw her as an ally now. A shared grievance, a silent understanding. He leaned toward her, speaking in hushed tones, his voice just low enough that James couldn't make out the words. But he didn't need to hear them. He had lived this script before. The woman nodded stiffly, lips pressed into a thin, nervous line. And then, she walked toward the cockpit. James exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. Here we go. The professor, who had been watching the scene unfold with the careful patience of a man who had seen too much, shifted slightly in his seat. They never take it well, do they? James smirked, though there was little humor in it. No, they don't. Minutes passed. Then the captain appeared. His expression was composed, but James could see the weight behind his eyes. He had been pulled into something he didn't want to be part of. But that was the thing about these moments, whether you wanted to be involved or not. They found you. He walked toward James, stopping just beside his seat. "Mr. Carter," he said, voice low, almost apologetic. James turned his head slowly, meeting his gaze with a quiet, knowing patience. "Captain." The captain hesitated, just for a second. Then, he took a deep breath. "There's been a concern raised." James let the words hang between them. He could feel the attention shifting in the cabin again. The whispers had returned, small and sharp, slithering between the rows like snakes in the grass. The businessman was watching, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. James folded his hands in his lap, his expression unreadable. "A concern." The captain nodded. "One of our crew members has expressed some discomfort regarding your behavior." The words were so predictable, so familiar, that for a moment, James almost laughed. There it was, the old, reliable tactic. When power was lost, when dignity was stripped away, when no logical argument could be made, they reached for the final, desperate card: fear, the unspoken accusation, the quiet, whispered danger, the implication that a man like James, wealthy, successful, unapologetic, was somehow still a threat. James tilted his head slightly. "And what exactly have I done to cause discomfort?" The captain hesitated again, and in that hesitation, James knew he knew that the man had no answer. Because there was no answer. Not one that could be said aloud. But still, the captain tried. "There have been reports that you've made some of the other passengers uneasy," he said, voice careful, each word measured. "Uneasy." James let the words sit between them. Heavy, deliberate. And then, finally, he let out a slow breath and smiled. Not the kind of smile that was warm. Not the kind of smile that made anyone comfortable. but the kind of smile that reminded people exactly who they were speaking to. He straightened slightly, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeve. "Tell me, Captain." The man swallowed. "Yes?" James leaned in, just enough that only he could hear. "What part of the way I exist makes them uneasy?" The captain's throat bobbed. He had no answer to that either. Because he understood now. James hadn't raised his voice. James hadn't been aggressive. James hadn't done anything except exist in a space they had not wanted to see him in. And yet, somehow, that had been enough. James exhaled, slow and deliberate. "If you have a legitimate concern about my behavior, Captain, I would love to hear it." The captain said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And then, from behind them, a voice spoke up. It was the professor. "I'd like to raise a concern, Captain." The captain turned, startled. "Sir?" The professor folded his hands neatly over his stomach. His expression calm. "I've been made uneasy by a particular passenger as well." The businessman stiffened. The professor gestured with a slow nod. The gentleman sitting a few rows back. The businessman's face flushed. "Over the course of this flight," the professor continued smoothly, "I've been subjected to passive hostility, overheard inflammatory remarks, and witnessed a blatant attempt to undermine a fellow passenger's right to fair and equal treatment." His eyes flicked toward the businessman. "I'd like to know what you plan to do about that, Captain." The cabin was silent. The captain shifted on his feet. He looked between James, the professor, and the businessman, and James saw at the moment he realized there was no way out. Because to acknowledge the businessman's behavior would be to admit what this was really about. And to ignore it would expose the double standard. The captain cleared his throat. We want to ensure all our passengers feel comfortable." The professor nodded. "Yes, so do we." The captain hesitated, then turned to James. "There will be no further issues, Mr. Carter." James smiled slightly. "I didn't think there would be." The captain nodded stiffly and walked back toward the cockpit, his face tight with unspoken thoughts. The businessman, humiliated and fuming, sank back into his seat. James glanced at the professor. The old man smirked. "I may be retired, son, but I didn't forget how the game is played." James chuckled. "Good." He let his head rest against the seat. The hum of the plane steady beneath him. Because this time the story had ended differently. The hum of the engines filled the cabin with a steady, unchanging rhythm, a heartbeat of metal and power cutting through the sky. But inside, there was another storm brewing. A quiet one, a storm of resentment, of unease, of power shifting in real time. James Carter could feel it. He had felt it all his life, the way people adjusted when confronted with something they couldn't control. Something they had long believed belonged to them and them alone. Some men, when stripped of the illusions that made them comfortable, lashed out. Some folded into themselves, realizing they had been wrong. But others waited for the right moment to strike back. James had seen the businessman's face when the captain backed down, when the professor had turned his own game against him. The kind of man who had never had to fight for a seat in his life suddenly realizing that his status, his certainty, his entitlement had not been enough. And that kind of realization, it burned. James exhaled slowly, adjusting his cuffs. He wasn't afraid. No, never afraid. But he was prepared. And sure enough, the moment arrived. A sudden, sharp jolt. The plane lurched, not violently, but enough to send a ripple of discomfort through the passengers. A few gasps echoed through the cabin, the seatbelt signs flashing back on. The captain's voice cut through the intercom, smooth and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." James glanced toward the businessman, who was gripping his armrests too tightly. His breathing shallow. He had not moved since his earlier defeat. But there was something in his eyes now, a simmering, quiet calculation. Then the second jolt. Stronger this time. The plane dipped. Just for a moment. Just enough for the world to feel suddenly, briefly, out of control. And that's when the businessman saw his chance. He unbuckled his seatbelt. James noticed it immediately. So did the flight attendants. "Sir, please remain seated," one of them said, her voice firm but polite. The businessman didn't respond. He was already moving, pushing past the first-class passengers, striding toward the front of the cabin, toward the cockpit. James sat up. His instincts kicked in, that deep, bone-deep understanding that something was off. The businessman didn't just look unsettled. He looked determined. James unbuckled his own seatbelt. The plane shook again. A few people let out nervous cries. Luggage compartments rattled above them. The businessman kept moving. "Sir." The flight attendant's voice was louder now. "You need to sit down. I need to speak to the captain," the businessman said sharply, not looking back. "This flight has become unsafe." Unsafe. James felt the weight of that word settle over the cabin like a thick fog. He knew what was coming before it even arrived. This entire situation is out of control. The businessman continued, raising his voice now, turning slightly so that the passengers, the audience, could hear. "We all saw what happened earlier. We all know the kind of people who are making this flight a problem." There it was. James stood, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a kind of slow, inevitable movement. "Sit down," James said, his voice low. The businessman turned fully now, locking eyes with him. "I beg your pardon?" James took a step forward. He could hear the tension shifting in the cabin, could feel the passengers caught between fear and curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. "You're not going to the cockpit," James said, measured, calm. "You're going to sit down." The businessman let out a short, forced laugh. "Are you threatening me?" James took another step. "No," he said, "I'm telling you." A silence. A heavy, charged, dangerous silence. The businessman's face twisted into something raw and exposed. A man whose power had always been implied, suddenly realizing he was in a place where it wasn't enough. He opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to escalate, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "The professor. I'd listen to the man if I were you." The businessman turned. The professor sat in his seat, legs crossed, gaze steady. He had not moved since the plane first shook, had not reacted to the panic, the chaos, the power struggle. And that, James knew, was the real authority in the room. The businessman scoffed, shaking his head. "This is absurd." And then, security arrived. 2 flight marshals, moving down the aisle with purpose. Their eyes locked onto the businessman. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "take your seat." Now, the businessman's eyes darted between James, the professor, the marshals, realizing, in real time, that he had lost again. But this time, the loss was public. He clenched his jaw. And then, slowly, he turned and made his way back to his seat. The plane shook once more. But this time, the turbulence wasn't outside. It was inside. James exhaled, returning to his own seat. But he knew this fight wasn't over. Not this flight. Not this country. Not this world. The weight of it pressed down on him. But he did not buckle. Because he knew, as sure as he knew his own name, that the burden of history was never carried by the weak. And tonight, the sky belonged to him. The plane sliced through the sky. Steady now, the turbulence having settled into a restless kind of quiet. But inside the cabin, the storm had not passed. James Carter sat in his seat, his body still, his mind sharp. He could feel the weight of every glance, every hushed whisper, the unspoken tension thick in the recycled air. The businessman had been forced to sit down. But men like him never truly sat down. No, they stewed, they plotted, they waited for the next moment, the next angle, the next chance to reclaim what they believed was theirs. The professor, now fully reclined in the seat James had given him, let out a slow exhale. He looked over, giving James a knowing glance. "They never go quietly," he murmured. James smirked. "No, they don't." The businessman had not moved since his failed power play. But James knew men like him. He was calculating, waiting for his moment to strike again. And that moment came 40 minutes before landing. The flight attendant returned to the first-class cabin, her face tight, her body tense. She hesitated just long enough for James to recognize that something was wrong. Then, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "the captain would like a word with you." James exhaled slowly. And there it was. It didn't matter how much power he had. It didn't matter that he had earned his seat. It didn't matter that he had won the battle. Because power, real power, does not rest in the hands of a single victory. It is tested, pushed, forced to prove itself again and again. James nodded, rising from his seat. He could feel the passengers watching him again. The weight of expectation, curiosity, resentment pressing against him like a wall. The businessman didn't look at him directly. But James saw the satisfaction in his expression. James followed the flight attendant through the narrow aisle, past the silent, still faces of passengers who pretended not to be invested in what came next. The captain was waiting just outside the cockpit, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral, but James could see it: the hesitation, the discomfort, the guilt. And guilt, James knew, was a weapon. "Mr. Carter," the captain began, his voice level but cautious. "There's been another complaint." James raised an eyebrow. "Slow, deliberate, another one." The captain exhaled. "It's been brought to my attention that some passengers are feeling uncomfortable with your presence in first class." James let the words settle. Heavy and absurd. "My presence?" The captain cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "They believe your behavior has been disruptive." A small smile curled at the edge of James's mouth. Not amusement, not surprise, recognition. Because this was the last move of men like the businessman. When they could no longer argue with facts, with policy, with logic, they reached for fear. James nodded slowly. "Let me guess," he said. "A particular passenger has raised this concern?" The captain hesitated. I can't disclose that." James chuckled, low and knowing. "Of course not." The silence stretched. Then, the professor's voice, steady and sharp, cut through it. "I'd like to raise a complaint as well." James turned. The professor had followed. He stood just behind them, arms crossed, his old but powerful voice carrying the weight of experience, resistance, memory. The captain blinked. "Sir?" The professor stepped forward. "I'm uncomfortable too." He let the words settle for a moment before continuing. "I'm uncomfortable with the fact that the only passenger whose presence has been called into question is a man who, as far as I can tell, has done nothing more than exist in a seat that others believed was not his to claim." The captain's jaw tightened. The professor wasn't finished. "I'm uncomfortable with the real disruption happening on this flight, the way certain people have been allowed to push a narrative of fear because they don't like what they see." His eyes flicked toward the businessman's seat before returning to the captain. "And I'd like to know what you plan to do about that complaint." The businessman stiffened. James smiled. The captain hesitated because now the rules had changed. To act against James would be to prove what had been happening all along. To ignore the professor's words would be to validate them. He exhaled. "There will be no further discussion on this matter," the captain said finally. His voice was clipped, forced, but the decision had been made. "Please return to your seats." The professor smiled. "Gladly." James locked eyes with the businessman as he walked past. The man didn't speak. Not this time. Because now, he knew, he had lost. And not just this battle, but the larger one. The one that told men like him that the world belonged to them. That their discomfort was law. That their assumptions were truth. Not anymore. Not tonight. James returned to his seat. The professor sat beside him, stretching slightly, his expression relaxed. "Well," the older man said, shaking his head, "that was quite the landing before the landing." James chuckled, taking his seat, finally allowing himself to breathe. He looked out the window. The city lights of London glowed beneath them, stretching across the land like veins of gold. A new world, a new place, a reminder that the fight never stayed in one space for long. It moved. It traveled. It waited in airports, in boardrooms, in hotel lobbies, in offices, in the air itself. But James knew something now. Knew it the way the businessman now knew it. The way the professor had always known it. They could fight it. They could resist it. They could whisper and complain and push back. But the world had already shifted. And no turbulence could stop what was already in motion. The wheels touched the ground. The plane slowed. And as James Carter stepped off, walking toward a future that no one could take from him, he smiled. Because this time, they had all seen it happen.